Hello and welcome to the virtual Scandinavia House and today's book talk, Salka Valka, featuring the book's translator, Philip Roughton. Also joining today is Doug McIntyre as they discuss the celebrated Icelandic novelist and Nobel Prize laureate Haldor Laxness' novel, Salka Valka, which is published with a new translation by Philip on June 7th by Archipelago. A big thank you to our friends at Archipelago for helping making this possible. This talk is being recorded and will be made available on our website, scandinavias.org, as well as our YouTube page. Feel free to ask questions in the chat section and we'll get to them towards the end of the program. I'll also put a link to where one can purchase the book. Haldor Laxness, born in 1902 and died in 1998, is the undisputed master of modern Icelandic fiction. He was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1955. His body of works includes novels, essays, poems, plays, stories, and memoirs, more than 60 books in all. His works available in English include The Independent People, The Fish Can Sing, World Light, Under the Glacier, The Great Weaver from Kashmir, and Wayward Heroes. Philip Roughton is award-winning translator of Icelandic literature. His translations include works by Laxness, John Kalman Stephenson, Bergvin Birgersson, Steinen Sigurdsdóttir, and others. He is awarded the 2015 American Scandinavian Foundation Translation Prize for his translations of Wayward Heroes, and the Oxford Wendenfield Prize in 2016 for his translations of Jan Kalmar Stephenson's Heart of Man. And moderating today is Doug McIntyre. He is the principal opinion columnist for the Southern California News Group, which includes the Los Angeles Daily News, Orange County Register, and San Bernardino Sun, among others. In 2010, he was awarded Best Columnist by the California Newspapers Association. He has also written for many publications, including Los Angeles Times, LA Jazz Scene, and the Bridgeport Post. Doug's debut novel, Frank's Shadow, published by Greenleaf Books, will be published in 2023. So please welcome Doug and Phil.
Thank you, Kyle. And good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on which time zone you happen to be in. I am Doug McIntyre, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you on behalf of Scandinavia House, the Nordic Center in America, and the American Scandinavian Foundation, as well as Archipelago Books, for a conversation with Philip Roughton, the preeminent English language translator of Icelandic literature, specifically the brand new translation of Haldor Laxness's classic novel, Salka Valka, now in print from Archipelago Books. It is a total joy to bring on board with us now Philip Roughton from Iceland. Phil, what time is it there where you are now?
5 o'clock.
It's about 5 p.m.
5 p.m.
It's a little after 10 a.m. here in Los Angeles, where it's above 100 degrees, which is not the case where you are, I assume.
Well, rainy and windy here in Iceland. So.
And some of the rain to us, we could sure use it. Phil, this will be a fun and hopefully free-ranging conversation, and we do encourage our listener viewers questions. So please send them in as they occur to you, and we'll try to get to as many of them as possible. Let's start with some basics. Who was Haldor Laxness?
So Haldor Laxness is Iceland's one and only Nobel laureate. And he, as Kyle mentioned, he was born in 1902 and lived until 1998. And so his life spanned the 20th century. Laxness is sort of omnipresent here in Iceland. And actually, if I want to give one little thanks. I'd like to thank a lot of different people here, Scandinavia House, American Scandinavian Foundation, and Archipelago, and you for agreeing to do this, and for the encouragement, and for the not least the great cover art. But I'd also like to thank the late Jack Sheldon, great jazz trumpeter, who I think it's through him that we first became acquainted, Doug.
Yeah.
He sent me a message on Facebook, and just to sort of express his admiration of Laxness, how great of a fan of Laxness he is. was and how much he appreciated these translations. And I actually found this quite touching. Unfortunately, I didn't see the email, the message for quite some time. It was in that sort of weird trash inbox or something on Facebook. But when I did see it, I found it really touching. And it sort of like opened my eyes up to the world of Laxness fans outside of Iceland. I think here in Iceland, it's a little bit sort of taken for granted, you know, and so I started to think, you know, it was very interesting to hear from this great jazz trumpeter. He's a big Laxness fan. Maybe, I don't know if he introduced Laxness to you, Doug, or you to him, but he certainly is, you know, he has fans everywhere. His influence in literature is found widely. Laxness was not entirely appreciated, both in Iceland and abroad. He was sort of blacklisted, I guess, in the States for his communist sympathies. And here in Iceland, he was criticized for being an iconoclast. He did editions of the Icelandic sagas, which were considered sort of the holy grail of Icelandic literature, and he modernized the spelling in them. He was quick to criticize Icelanders for various of their foibles. He wrote an essay about in which he tried to persuade Icelanders to stop hacking up, coughing really loudly at the theater, things like this. And he wrote about the electrification of the countryside. He was very interested in social and political issues. Some Icelanders didn't appreciate his criticism of Icelandic society, and his books sometimes were banned in elementary school because teachers did, because he spelled things differently than the sort of official Icelandic. So they didn't want to sort of ruin the school children with his books. So he was also pursued by conservatives in Iceland. A conservative politician named Jonas from Hrifla, he sort of got after Laxness, and they tried to get him on tax evasion charges. So Laxness, and also people criticized him for sort of stealing characters. Some people, I think the story goes that characters in independent people didn't appreciate that actual living people had been sort of appropriated and stuck into that book. So he's not sort of a shining hero, although I think these days he is. Whereas during his lifetime, he was more sort of, you know, criticized and then lauded after he received.
Well, that's frequently the path of artists. You know, there's an old aphorism: the nail that sticks up gets hammered down. And I think the more insular a society that you live in, the more you stray from those social conventions and even cultural conventions, the more hackles get raised. But Laxness, it appears to me, and I'm not a scholar of Laxness, just a fan, but it appears to me when you read his biography, which, by the way, you did a wonderful translation of, the book is called The Islander, he was a searcher, and he sort of ping-ponged from devotional belief system to devotional belief system. For a while, he was a very devoted Catholic, and he abandoned Catholicism for essentially communism, which for a period of years through, and we'll deal with this because it is a controversy, he really was kind of one of Stalin's useful idiots, in the sense that he went to the Soviet Union and he was blinded to the realities of the oppression, including of artists' rights, but eventually came out of that as well. Is it fair to say that ultimately Laxness came to believe in people and nature?
Yeah, it's hard to say what he ultimately came to believe in. If you visit his house down in near Reykjavik, you see the rosary next to his bed, and apparently he sort of maybe went a bit back to Catholicism at the end of his life, and you see you hear about his sort of championing of the working man, the poor man, and then he has a Jaguar in the parking lot, and he used to stay. I mean, in the driveway, not the parking lot, but he used to stay at the most expensive hotels in Europe when he went abroad to write. And he would always go abroad to write, and he would stay, the luxury hotels in Copenhagen and Stockholm and elsewhere. And so to believe in, it's a little hard to say, but nature, it's very, very interesting to watch what's happening with nature in his novels. For instance, in Iceland's Bell, there are almost no mentions of nature, whereas in Salka Valka, it plays a very important part in sort of the relationship with the village and with Salka and human nature. So those are really interesting questions to ask. And I don't know if I could comment on what he actually believed in the end, but there is one thing about Laxness that is very important, and that's he was extremely playful. And in one of the recent reviews of Salka Valka, the reviewer gets it quite right, I think, that when he says that Laxness's prose sings right through with laughter. And he also mentions that Laxness once said, "I must be getting old. It isn't as much fun shocking the bourgeoisie anymore." So you can see that Laxness, he loved to play. And I think that's one of the things that I enjoy most about translating Laxness is this playfulness and this musicality. Laxness said that when he died, he wanted to hear music, and you can actually sense the music and the humor throughout his writing. So, yeah.
Let me ask you, why do you think? And I know this question is an informed guess on your part, but why do you think Laxness preferred to write his works from outside of Iceland, looking as maybe back at the country?
I'm not quite sure about that, but I think it was just that sort of like get away and find a space where he could focus entirely on his writing. So he had his wife and daughters at home, so maybe it was just sort of like get peace and quiet from the family or something like that. That's a speculation, yeah.
And on the subject of humor, Laxness frequently wrote about people living under grim circumstances, and yet it is leavened with a wry humor that is often very subtle. As a translator, capturing that sense of humor, I've always thought that to be able to tell a joke in another language, in a second or third language, is the highest form of translation. That if you can get a laugh deliberately in another language, God knows I've gotten laughs when I've tried to speak Spanish, but that not intentionally. But you have in your hands the source material of beloved literature in Iceland. And in order to capture the voice of humor, is that the biggest challenge that you are faced as a translator?
Sometimes it is. With Laxness, there are other challenges. He can make up words and concepts. Like one of the words in Salka Valka that plays an important part is called rökksemd, and it's, I don't know if it's entirely made up, but I don't think I could find it in a dictionary. And it's sort of, I translated it, rökksemd heimsins, as the ways of the world. And Laxness is good at inventing. Actually, every Laxness translator needs this book right here, which is called The Key, The Key to Haldor Laxness. And it takes 4 of his novels, and this is for Icelandic readers, 4 of his novels, and just glosses all the words that they might not know. So, and also he had his own kind of spelling, so sometimes that can trip people up a little bit. But the humor, yeah, it's, I think a lot of the times it comes through. I know that when I'm translating Laxness, sometimes I'll just stop and laugh because it's just hilarious what he writes. Or if it's not strictly hilarious, it's so ironic or sarcastic or something, turning things over on their head that you just shake your head. It's like, did you really write that? And there are a couple of things in Salka Valka that there are some very humorous scenes. For instance, when the school teacher is questioning Salka Valka, and he says, "Do you know any Icelandic poems?" And she says, "Yeah, eeny, meeny, miny, mo." And then she realized in Icelandic, it's sort of equivalent in Icelandic, which is a kid's song. And then she says, or the school teacher says, "Do you know who Jón Sigurðsson is?" And that was the great champion of Icelandic independence.
Yeah.
Salka says, "Oh yeah, he's a crew member on the Leo," which is the name of a boat. So it's these kind of things. And then there's also a scene in which Salka is talking to the priest and going through some Bible readings, and they come across Habakkuk, and it says that Salka could almost not help from laughing. And there's a joke there because in Icelandic, the word kukur means, excuse my English, it means shit. So when she reads the name Habakkuk, she's like, what kind of names are these in the Bible? And the joke there is that she reads the word, it's spelled in Icelandic like the word shit. So that's the kind of thing you actually can't translate. So like I can't, and it's a little bit stupid to give a footnote there. Like,
well, so. as a translator, could you talk to us about this part of the process? Every culture has its own unique cultural references. Like, for instance, I always thought when you're shooting pool in America, you could say you could put English on the ball. And I'm wondering if in Belgium they say we're putting Flemish on the ball. You know, I mean, who knows? In America, we have many baseball references, you know, out in left field, they couldn't get to first base. When you are confronted with a cultural reference that is unique to Iceland, what do you do as a translator to make that universally understood?
I think I think in translation theory, this is something called like dynamic equivalence or formal equivalence. And I think the classic example is for the Inuits, the Lamb of God would be translated Seal of God or something like that. So, or like your example that you just gave. And in Icelandic, I run into that occasionally. There is one interesting example in Salka Valka where the kids are singing, "Here we go round the juniper bush," you know, which we would say mulberry bush. Here we go round. But in Icelandic, it's actually the juniper bush. And I thought, why the heck not just leave it? Because they don't have mulberry bushes in Iceland. And there's another one, I think in one of my early drafts of Valka, I had Steinthor, the scoundrel, translated something that he had ants in his pants, which didn't actually sound appropriate for the tone of the novel, besides the fact that there are no ants in Iceland, or very few ants in Iceland. So you can't really translate, I don't think, you can't really use ants in your pants in an Icelandic novel. So there's another novel that I just translated uses the phrase pinworm on his anus. So as the that's the Icelandic equivalent of ants in your pants. So
let's talk about Salka Valka specifically. Earlier, I asked you who was Haldor Laxness. Who is Salka Valka?
Salka she's also an iconoclast, I think you could say, or if a deliberate one, at least the way she is, sort of turns the village's collective heads. And another reviewer of Salka Valka mentions this in the Oxonian, that there's a kind of collective shaming of Salka Valka, not just for the way that she dresses, but also for her relationship with Steinthor, which, if you read the novel, you know that Steinthor, there's a kind of a rape scene which is called Salka's first personal experience of love. And but Salka ends up continuing to take money from Steinthor. Now, Salka, she wears trousers, she cuts her hair short like a boy. So there's I find Salka so interesting because she's really genuinely real. Like, you can feel almost every sort of like bit of her through the novel, everything she goes through in her heart and her head. And there's actually a study that I read by one of my colleagues here in Iceland, Jón Ingvi Jóhannsson, who says that you have a kind of mirroring in Salka in the first part and the second part. You have, the first part is the Salvation Army, second part you have the trade unions, and they're both sort of these structures that take people away from the vagaries of everyday life. They give them something to believe in, some kind of hope. But these are also sort of like dreamlands or dream visions, and so you have, they're not real. And then you have Arnaldur, and you have Sigurlína, Salka's mother, who are, Sigurlína is wrapped up in the Salvation Army, Arnaldur is wrapped up in the trade unions, and he wants to turn the village of Óseyri into another world. And Salka tells Arnaldur that he's an elf man, that he doesn't live in reality. He has all these dreams, but that they don't have anything to do with the reality of the village. And her reality is washing fish. And you get all these quotations about the village, the life is fish and of fish, and the people that are made of fish. And Salka tells Arnaldur, you're full of the ways of the world, these sort of structures that we put on it to take us somewhere else. And he has this dream about this woman behind the blue mountain, and that's his mother. And then in the end of the novel, this is a little bit of a spoiler alert, he has this vision of this woman, he goes off with this woman in California. And so he sort of abandons all these dreams. But Salka, Steinthor and Salka have a strange relationship because Steinthor abuses her, he's violent to her. And Salka actually is can be seen as a kind of a Me Too movement type of character. But Steinthor, he always brags to himself, I am what I am. And Salka at one point says the same thing, I am what I am, to Arnaldur. But there's a difference in that Salka she doesn't have any arrogance. She presents herself as this is all I am. And actually, in the end of the novel, she's left alone, and it's a little bit sad. Sorry about the spoiler alert. So, well,
Laxness wrote that Salka Valka decides to escape the fate of women, and she really is a uniquely interesting feminist character written by a male author at a time when very few men were focusing on women's stories, certainly as rebellious as Salka is. And does this come from, it has been said that that one of Laxness's most influential books that he read was Cervantes' Don Quixote. And it almost seems like there's a bit of tilting at windmills here by all the characters, but specifically Salka, who is up against maybe indomitable forces.
Yeah, I don't think Salka, I would disagree with the idea that Salka is tilting at windmills. I see Salka as more of like trying to be herself, and the village trying to make her, trying to wipe that individuality out, actually, because there's at one point the village is described as being colorless and static. And we know that Salka is described as being always fidgety. She's extremely colorful. She doesn't fit with any of the other villagers, the way she dresses and the way she acts and the way she speaks. And she's always fidgety. And the village is like communally shaming her. And then, so it's like, one reason why I really like the cover art that you provided is because the woman standing there at the fish market is faceless. I feel like sort of that the village, which is what Laxness originally wanted to call the novel, just the village, is sort of trying to wipe away that individuality of Salka, and she's desperately trying to hold on to it throughout the novel, which is very interesting. And Salka is also, I don't know if you've seen the film Summer with Monica by Bergman.
Mm-hmm.
She's a bit sort of like the character of Monica in Summer with Monica, in her sort of like rebelliousness, I suppose you could say. And it's very interesting in the film, Bergman makes Stockholm into some kind of like sort of nightmarish place devoid of personality. And I kind of see the village of Óseyri like that. And it's a very, I think if anybody out there, if you haven't seen Summer with Monica, see if you see any similarities to Salka Valka.
It's perfect that you brought up the subject of film, because Salka Valka, the novel, actually, and it's fascinating that I'm in Los Angeles and you're in Iceland, because there's a lot of Los Angeles organically in Salka Valka, because Laxness originally conceived it as a film and wanted Greta Garbo to play Salka Valka. And he is hardly the first novelist to come to Hollywood and fail to crack the Byzantine process of getting films made. Many, including F. Scott Fitzgerald and Faulkner came out here and met a similar fate. But I'm curious as to your take on how that experience, Laxness's trip to Los Angeles in the late 20s and his failure to crack that, how that impacted the development of this book, which he was clearly working on in a different form.
Yeah, what you read is that his experience in Los Angeles left him feeling bad about the fate of those with less, because he saw the sort of millionaires down there in Southern California, all around in Hollywood and its glamour, and this is what you read in biographies of Laxness, that it turned him off capitalism and turned him into a communist, or socialist, and then he was working on Salka Valka, in which socialism plays such an important part, but there's always there's never a cut and dry with Laxness, because in Salka Valka, the socialism, where it's most perfect is among the birds. And they're sort of like he actually says that he has this wonderful, wonderful description. Just like you read it and you think, who writes like this? Of the terns and of the birds with their perfectly socialistic society underneath the like capitalist colors of the sky. and I think that you see it's sort of like where a perfect socialist society works is among creatures that maybe, in his opinion, have less sort of like depth than the human being. Because, and I think there was a review by Jane Smiley that came out recently, and Jane Smiley said he really puts forth the question of whether the political and the personal can coexist. And I think that's a very good question to think about when reading Salka Valka, because for all the dreams that Arnaldur has, have this like deep, poignant romance between her and Salka, and two levels of the novel. It's like they never, he's almost like saying that political ideal can never work because of personality. So I don't know, I think I got away from your question, but the thing about the movie version that he wanted to do with Greta Garbo, honestly, I couldn't see Greta Garbo as Salka Valka, but I watched a couple of Garbo movies recently after finishing translating Salka Valka, Camille and Anna Karenina, and I really felt like I was reading a Laxness novel while watching those movies, because in them you have this focus on the drama between basically two individuals, and there's not much more that you need for good human drama. Maybe there's like the love triangle. There are always love triangles in Haldor Laxness too. And it reminded me of something, I think it might have been Chekhov, who wrote to his brother giving him advice for reading. And he said, when you're writing a story, make it two people, make it him and her. Don't complicate it. So, and you get that in Salka Valka. There's Salka and there's Arnaldur, but then there's also this Steinthor. So you get this, or in Summer with Monica, there's Harry and there's Monica, and then there's this guy called Lele who comes in and almost ruins everything. So, yeah. And I got away from your question again. I'm sorry.
That's okay. There's plenty more questions, Phil.
Okay.
You know, one of the things that always bugs me when people talk about music is they don't play the music. And in this case, the music is the language of Haldor Laxness. Why don't we take a moment here and allow you to treat us with some of the music by doing the reading?
Okay. I'm going to, maybe I should put a little quotation in the chat because people can see what I'm talking about. So there's one of my favorite scenes in Salka Valka is in chapter 17 in the first book, and it's when Boyesen is giving a speech to the village, and he's telling the villagers how much he loves them. Boyesen is the merchant who controls everything at the start of the book. And there's, after the speech, there's like everybody's drinking. They're in a kind of warehouse where fish are processed, and there's like fish offal all over the floor. Or maybe it's been swept to the side. But okay, I just put one in the chat there, a quotation. Maybe it's a little bit long, but okay. And there's a big fight between a sailor and the merchants. Hold on, let me find it here. The storekeeper's son and a sailor. And they come to blows over the merchant's daughter. The sailor called the other a good-for-nothing swellhead, etc. So they start fighting. And then it says that this and that person ended up in a salty puddle or heap of fish guts, while the young lady took the storekeeper's son home with her to clean him up. The dance stopped. The attendees gathered round the scrappers, the women trembling from head to toe and praying to God. Gradually, the fight lost steam. The storekeeper's son had already left with the merchant's daughter, and no one knew any longer why they were fighting. It all seemed to have been so pointless. Someone said that the merchant's daughter was a whore. And the quotation that I've given you, I'll read the English first and then the Icelandic. It says, "The women's club took care of the young sailor who was as grimy as a manure-smeared cow, all torn and tattered, his face bloody and his eyes teary with anger. They wiped the mud and brine off his suit and offered him free coffee. Someone from the women's club also called to Salka Valka and offered her free coffee because she had lost her brother. A drunk man sat there reciting poetry. A few people sighed heavily over the sorrows of human life, but the girl said nothing. The drunk tried to fix his eyes on her, but they were too centrifugal from Brennivine. He recited, 'In glory land the Lord did laugh, as death's side left but wisps of chaff, whisked from off the slenderest weeds, in God's bed of Swedes.'" So, and now in the Icelandic, when Laxness writes that a few people sighed heavily over the sorrows of human life, but the girl said nothing, the Icelandic is "Ýmsir urpu andni mæðilega yfir sorg mannlífsins." And I almost stopped it. I actually did stop in my tracks when I was translating this because the language there is so musical. It really struck me, and I actually said, I'm going to memorize that because I find it so beautiful. And there are times when you get this in Laxness, like all the time, when you sort of stop and shake your head and think and revel in the music of his language and actually sometimes get a little tear in your eye. This has happened to me before when I'm translating Laxness. So, "Ýmsir urpu andni mæðilega yfir sorg mannlífsins." And in the Guardian quotation given on the announcement about this talk, it says, "Laxness writes the unearthly prose of a poet, cased in the perfection of a shell of plot, wit, and clarity." And I think this is one thing that I love so much about Laxness's writing is its poetry. And I just want to give you one other example here from Laxness's contemporaries when he was young. It was a poet named Jóhann Jónsson. They were friends, and Jóhann Jónsson wrote what I think is one of the most beautiful poems written, not just in Icelandic, but in any language that I've read. And the poem is called Söknuður, which means basically regret. Actually, Söknuður is one of the most difficult words to translate with just one word from Icelandic. And Jón Kalman Stephenson loves this word and uses it all the time. Söknuður, it can mean regret, it can mean the pain of loss, it can mean missing someone, it can mean nostalgia. And so it's hard to just translate it like he was filled with Söknuður, he was filled with missing. It doesn't work in English. So we need a few of these words that are like encompass so much in just one word. But in Jóhann Jónsson's poem Söknuður, he writes, "Hvar hafa dagar lífstíns líkinum glatað, og ljóðin þuttu þitt blóð frá draumi til draums. Hvar urðu þau veðruna bráð og barn, og því hugðir borið með undursamleikans eigin þróttlausan brunn þér í brjósti. Hvar." And it's just this beautiful alliteration and alternation between consonants and vowels that Laxness, you see all the time in Laxness. And Jóhann Jónsson is said to be one of the first modernist poets in Iceland. And you can actually see that, being a contemporary of Laxness, that they were interested in that same kind of musical language. So it's a beautiful, beautiful poem. And it's sad. And Jóhann Jónsson died young of tuberculosis So that's just one little example. Oh, the thing about the example that I gave about these several people sighed over the sorrows of human life is that typical Laxness wit, because they're sighing over is a drunken brawl, you know, over the merchant's daughter. So it's just hilarious actually when you read it. He does that all the time. Just takes these. The sorrows of human life should be the grand stuff of grand novels, and he turns it into just something funny. So
I want to, Phil, I want to ask you about your process, the process of taking literature in one language and offering it to enormous audience that speaks a different language. And the challenge specifically, I mean, for instance, Laxness himself did translations. He translated Hemingway, for instance, into Icelandic. When you take a beloved or revered author, a Mark Twain for America, for instance, or a Hemingway, and certainly Laxness, and you're the translator, is there an extra level of pressure to get it right because the source material is sort of iconic? It's not sort of iconic, it's absolutely iconic. But is there an extra level of pressure for the translator to be careful on how you go about this?
Very much so. You feel the weight of it. But I was lucky because when the first book that I translated, Iceland's Bell, I had no real idea how weighty Laxness is. And I've mentioned this elsewhere to friends in another interview too, that I just sort of dived in. I wanted to read a bit of Laxness and learn Icelandic better. And there was no I wanted to have a translation side by side so that I could, you know, see what was actually going on there. But there was no translation of Iceland's Bell, so I just decided I'll do that. And then later it turned out that Iceland's Bell is considered to be untranslatable, or was considered to be. And actually, one day I was at the Manuscript Institute in Reykjavik, and I walked in there to the coffee time, and I had been sort of searching for something to try to say, because they all like to tell stories and jokes and things like this, and it's hard to get in the conversation. So I just thought, okay, I'll throw some Laxness at them, see what happens. And so I use this quotation from Iceland's Bell. Solar gangur var nú orðin langur, en kulda þræsingar sem oft vill verða á útmánuðum, which means the sun's course had lengthened considerably, but cold winds blew as often do during the closing weeks of winter. And when I said that, people's eyes widened and their mouths sort of fell open. Right then, I just knew these are scholars of Icelandic language and literature. And I just knew right then, uh-oh, what am I doing with Laxness? And they said, that's golden, classic, beautiful Icelandic. His Icelandic is beautiful. And there's a musicality to it. And so, yeah, so then you get the depth, the sense of the weight of the language. You get people telling you he's untranslatable. A little girl once told me, stop talking like him because you're starting to sound like him. I mean, stop translating him because you're starting to sound like him. A horse farmer told me Iceland's Bell encapsulates the spirit of the Icelandic people more than any other book.
It's one of my favorites. And by the way, it's the book that introduced me to you, because this is the first one of your translations that I read, and I found it to be an incredible masterpiece. And this English language edition, by the way, has one of the funniest introductions I've ever read of any book.
By Adam, what's his name? Hazlitt?
Yeah, it's hilarious. It talks about all the things this book has going against it, and yet it somehow transcends all of that. I want to go back to his first novel, which you also translated for Archipelago, The Great Weaver from Kashmir. because this book is fascinating to me because it's to me, in reading it, Laxness had not yet found the voice that would make him famous. It almost reads to me like a society drama, a drawing room drama that could have been written by Cole Porter, Cole Porter song, or Fitzgerald. You know, I kept reading saying, well, where is the croft? Where is the home field? Where are the sheep? Where, but it was also written in the 20s when he was a young man and still looking for his voice, in essence.
Yeah, it's sort of considered a bit youngish, juvenile, because he sort of throws everything in there that he possibly can. So avant-garde poetry, some philosophy, reflections on Catholicism, his stay in the monastery in Luxembourg. And I tend to consider that novel to be sort of a prose equivalent of T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, because Eliot is sort of picking up the pieces of Europe post-World War I, and I think Laxness is doing the same with Great Weaver from Kashmir. And he's also like exploring the Icelandic character away from Iceland. And Laxness wanted to write for the world. He was determined very early on to write for the world. And I think that Great Weaver was his first attempt to do that. Then later he sort of abandoned that and decided he would write Icelandic novels, which is sheep and all that kind of stuff. But Laxness also worked extremely hard to get his books translated into other languages. There was one of the other main writers at his time was Gunnar Gunnarsson, but he wrote in Danish. And Laxness knew that to be a writer for the world, he had to have his books translated. And so he was kind of a champion. To me, he's a champion of translators. He's not just a champion of Icelandic literature, because he worked really, really hard to get those, and traveled around and met publishers and translators and worked with translators. And so an interesting and funny story is I went to visit this monastery in Luxembourg where he stayed, the same Clairvaux, and I knocked on the door. A monk answered, and I said, well, I just came to see where Laxness stayed. And he said, yes, Laxness stayed here. I'm sorry, we don't have any stick-on footprints on the floor for you. So I think that Laxness would have appreciated that humorous monk. So yeah.
Back to the topic of your process as a translator. First of all, if you could, tell us how this project came to you. You had done a translation of Wayward Heroes for Archipelago Books, which is also available, by the way, and a great read. Did you propose a new translation of Salka Valka? Did somebody at Archipelago suggest it? Walk us through that process.
I think that Jill Kuhlman, the editor at Archipelago, after Great Weaver was published, said, let's do another Laxness. And actually, after Wayward came out, she said, let's do another one. And I said, what about Salka Valka? I had actually started Salka Valka like way back when I started Iceland's Bell. I have some files that go way back to my old Toshiba Nothing word processing little unit. So, and it's very interesting to see, because usually when I translate, the first pass is always sort of like 3 or 4 different options for each sentence, or sometimes for a word, maybe 7 or 8 different options. So when you get the first pass, it's like expanded out to about that much.
That's fascinating.
And then you sort of whittle it down, sort of like, and decide whether it's going to be family style serving or whole cuisine serving. You know, you pick it and arrange and things like this. And usually by the end, it's just like looking at the clock and going, okay, I have 12 days to do 140 pages and sweating bullets, you know. It's not fun. But but yeah, I look at the Salka earliest attempt at Salka, and there are so many for each word. It's because I didn't know much Icelandic back then, so it's very fun.
Now, when you take on a project, do you, especially I think for Salka Valka in particular, because it is political and it was written at a moment in Laxness's life when he was becoming a true believer of a new ism. Do you do historical context research before you launch in? You want to know what was he thinking, what was going on in Iceland at the time, what was going on in the world at the time, to put it into a context?
Yeah, I usually don't do any research beforehand, but as you go through, you have to research everything. And that's part of the translator's joy, actually, is that it can also be sort of a curse because you spend so much time reading everything about everything else. So
I know exactly what you're talking about.
It just
and
really,
I'm not a translator, but you can fall into a wormhole of research.
Yeah,
and never climb out of it.
I mean, there's one of the difficult phrases in Salka Valka is the vola vola of the eider ducks. And I have to spend an hour or two listening to eider duck calls on YouTube because I wanted to know whether there was meaning in the way that Laxness wrote the sound of their calls or whether he was just trying to imitate the call. And so everyone who's heard an eider duck knows that haunting and beautiful woo, woo that they make, but the vola was a little bit different. But after listening to tape after tape of eider duck calls, I finally figured it was just that. So, and I asked other Icelanders about that too. But I mean, for translation, you read everything and things you just never thought you would ever be researching. It's quite fun. It's yeah. What a word.
Phil, how significant a literary figure is Haldor Laxness?
Significant. He's Laxness. There's no one. Laxness deserves every smidgen of praise that he gets for being one of the top writers of world literature. I think that Laxness, his writing is a bit like the Icelandic landscape. When you're traveling around in Iceland, every time you turn your head, there's something striking. And that kind of can make you think differently about the world, actually. And Laxness is like this, and it's very difficult to talk about Laxness sort of isolated passages because they, like, the richness of his writing is to me quite unique. And I think he's just up there with the best of the best. And like I said, there are passages where I just sometimes go, nobody else writes like this. Just that blend of humor and beauty and pathos and emotion and also the realism of the characters. And you mentioned this Salka, her portrayal, Laxness's ability to portray the inner life of women and girls has been noted more than once. It's extraordinary. And actually, I saw a show the other day, Great Canal Journeys. Giles was talking about the Staffordshire potteries, and he mentioned a writer named Arnold Bennett, with whom I'm not familiar, but apparently Arnold Bennett, who wrote about the workers in the pottery kilns, was extremely good at known for capturing the inner life of women. And I'm sort of seeing a little parallel between him and Laxness.
With that said, where does Salka Valka fall in the canon of Laxness's work?
It's the best of the best. It's the masterpiece of masterpieces. It's the fullest novel. It's the fullest portrayal of an individual character. You can go as deep as you want with analysis of it, the sort of structure of it, and the parallels between characters, yeah, it's just after I translated Salka, I basically just had to sit back and say, wow, you know, it's just extraordinary, this novel. So than I did with Wayward Heroes or The Great. I have to apologize for my cat. He's sort of being a pain.
Oh no, cats are always welcome in my work. Phil, here's my last question, and then we'll invite Kyle to come back. And if we have some viewer questions, we can fold those in. But what is next for Philip Roughton?
I don't know if I'm allowed to say, but I think there's going to be another Laxness coming. And yeah, we're sort of running out of novels though. So the ones that there are a couple of his very youthful novels, Child of Nature and Under the Holy Mountain. I don't think they've stood the test of time so much. And there's another one, his very last novel, it's called God's Good Gifts, which is about a herring speculator. And I think that's sort of hasn't stood the test of time either. But there is one called A Parish Chronicle, which is about stories about the people in the countryside where Laxness lived. And it looks like we're going to be looking at that one to publish. And then there's another Johan Kalman novel coming out, and just a number of other projects going on. I also do a lot of work with the movie producer here, and so there's a lot of and also like work with the group Hatari, who's in the Eurovision for Iceland, and so which is very fun to do because their lyrics are not at all like Laxness. So there's always, if it's not a big name, there's always smaller names, and so you never know.
Great. Kyle, do we have any questions that we should get in from our viewers?
Yeah, we answered some already, but one was asking about Iceland's bell, which I think we covered already, and then Jenna is asking for if you could speak a bit about Laxness' choice of phrase, first experience of love, to refer to the rape scene, and how do you interpret his tone there?
Yeah, that's a really good question. The first personal experience of love. Very ironic, of course. That scene, Steinthor is vile, it's brutal, and it's just horrendous. And it's extraordinary, I think, that Laxness wrote that. And it turns out later in the novel that maybe the reality of rape is not quite what we thought, but yeah, there's nothing but sad irony in that first personal experience of love. So, and unfortunately, I think it speaks to some kind of a truth as well, because this is not something that's unheard of in real life. So we know all too well from the Me Too movement and things like this. So yeah.
Well, Phil, this hour flew by, and I thought that I should end with a quote from the man himself. In 1932, shortly after the publication of Salka Valka, Laxness wrote a letter in which he said, quote, "It is unlucky for a writer to be born in a tiny isolated country, condemned to a language that no one understands. But one day I hope that the stones in Iceland will speak to the whole world through me." And I think it's fair to say that the stones of Iceland not only speak through Haldor Laxness and with your assistance in the English-speaking world, they sing, thanks in no small part to you, Phil, and also to Archipelago Books for making this masterpiece available to those of us who are not fortunate enough to be bilingual in Icelandic. So thank you so much for today's readers and for future generations who now have Salka Valka on their bookshelves or will at some point. And while we're thanking people, I obviously want to thank Kyle Reinhardt, Archipelago Books, Scandinavia House, the Nordic Center, and for all of those of you joining us wherever you happen to may be. It is a pleasure to have been speaking with you, Phil. Thanks so much for having me. And tak, how's that for my translation?
Tak somuleiðis, which means thank you as well. So, and I agree with all the thanks that you gave to the American Scandinavian Foundation, Scandinavian House, Archipelago Books, Jill Schoolman, and yourself as well. Thank you for agreeing to do this. It's great to talk to you about. I want to know how you came to Laxness. Actually, maybe we can talk about that next time.
Yeah, and I would like to thank both you, Doug, and Phil, for joining us today. Thank you for the wonderful conversation. So please, we will be doing more literary events in the future. So please do. We'll hope you can come back and join us for those too. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Kyle.
Bye.
Thanks, Doug.